do you regret taking your family to Montreal and Quebec City at a cost of $17,000 and charging the taxpayers for that? Do you think that was an appropriate use of taxpayer money?
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone.
Today, we bring you a story that has flown under the radar for the past few weeks. Multiple news sources have reported that NDP MP Nikki Ashton spent over $17,000 of taxpayer money on a trip over Christmas. She claims it was to meet with quote-unquote stakeholders, but refused to say exactly who.
So, this is a press conference from April of this year, where Global News asked her about it. Let's take a look.
MP Ashton, can I ask you about a trip that you took in December 2022? Do you regret taking your family to Montreal and Quebec City at a cost of $17,000 and charging the taxpayers for that? Do you think that was an appropriate use of taxpayer money?
Well, first of all, I want to be clear. The House of Commons has very clear rules around MP travel. And the House of Commons also very much recognizes the work of MPs involves their critic areas, not just their constituencies, but also their critic areas. And that work involves travel, meeting with stakeholders, engaging with stakeholders that are connected to both our constituencies and our critic area. And as the official languages critic for the NDP, who was a leading voice on the modernization of the Official Languages Act C-13, which we were working on intently in the House of Commons at that time, I feel it's important that as anyone involved in official languages that we are engaging with people from Francophone communities across the country, and nowhere is more Francophone than Quebec and Quebec City. And I've been clear in terms of the details of that particular trip. I will also say part of what was being discussed was the trip to Ottawa, which we all take as MPs, and certainly indicated that there was some extenuating circumstances, including with respect to a bedbug infestation, which the House was very well aware of. But fundamentally, et ce que j'aimerais partager en français, qu'en tant que porte-parole officielle qui était fortement impliquée dans le travail dans la Chambre sur la modernisation de la langue officielle, le projet de loi C13, c'était important pour moi de pouvoir engager avec les gens au centre francophone vraiment de notre pays, à la ville de Québec, sur la question de la protection de la langue française, sur la question de la protection de la culture francophone et reconnaître aussi le travail qui se fait au Québec dans ce domaine, reconnaissant bien sûr le contexte grave que le français est en déclin partout au Canada, incluant au Québec. And I just want to be clear here. I submitted these claims as any MP does. The House reimbursed me, and as I noted, details were known in terms of some of the extenuating circumstances as well. I'd also very much like to answer any questions on what is really a life and death issue. That is what we are talking about here, and Canada's complicity in what's happening in Palestine.
Can you at least answer in English, though, who did you meet with in Quebec City and Montreal on the issue of the French language?
I met with various people, and I just want to be clear that the rules of the House of Commons are very clear. Whether we meet on constituency issues or critic areas, that's understood to be part of our work. And as I said, I had the chance to meet with various people who are connected to the issue of French language, French culture preservation, and which is an issue that is clearly not taken as seriously as it should in Canada, given the decline of French, not just outside of Quebec, but now increasingly in Quebec as well. And I'll say I really hope we can get back to a question on Canada's complicity in terms of what's happening, death and destruction in Palestine.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah. Yeah. So, this whole thing is about a trip that she took, and allegedly it was to deal with a urgent bedbug infestation. And she says she couldn't do this with her husband's help, so her husband came, and I guess because her husband came, her 2 kids had to come, and it's pretty wild.
It is pretty wild because one would imagine that you could probably hire a professional exterminator for less money, less cost to the taxpayer than would be to bring an entire family to Ottawa and then Quebec.
Well, let's get to a article that was actually published by the National Post, and this was published in June of this year.
NDP MP who billed taxpayers $17,000 for Christmas travel pays some of it back. Nikki Ashton, whose riding is in northern Manitoba, repaid $2,900, but says that most of the costs were necessary to meet with stakeholders and deal with an urgent bedbug situation.
Ashton told the news site Canada's National Observer that she repaid the Quebec portion of her expenses, 4 nights accommodation and meals, plus a vehicle rental for a total of approximately $2,900. But she noted that she needed her husband's help in dealing with the bedbug infestation in Ottawa, which was why he joined her on that portion of the trip. Ashton said in her statement, quote, "As a result of media reports around these travel claims, my family and I have been subjected to death threats, harassment, and abuse," end quote. She further told Canada's National Observer that this included threats on social media photos of her children and on the social media accounts of her husband, who ran for the NDP as a nomination candidate in 2014, but is now working as a teacher and Afghanistan veterans advocate.
We've said it before and we'll say it again. The MPs do not deserve threats or harassment or abuse. You can disagree with them and you can let them know that you disagree with them, but please don't threaten the MPs.
And leave their children alone, because their children didn't choose to be there. They didn't choose to, be a child of a public figure. And that goes for all children. Even Justin Trudeau's children, leave them alone. If you have an issue with the MP, then write them an email. But don't threaten them. Attack them on the policies. Attack them on what you disagree with them on, but attack them in a very professional way. That way there's no ammunition for them to use against you.
Or against the rest of us, because unfortunately they'll lump all people who may be right-leaning in with 1 or 2 extreme examples, which is number one, unfair. And I mean, it shouldn't be happening. We know you guys don't threaten the MPs, but just for whoever's listening, don't do it. Last year, an analysis of expenses by CTV News found that members of parliament spent more than $14.6 million of taxpayers' money on travel in the first half of 2023, roughly 10% increase over the previous 6 months. It noted that, aside from party leaders, Ashton was the second highest spender after Bloc Québécois MP Marlene Gill, racking up $131,527.53 in travel costs over 6 months. The analysis also found that, by party, the NDP had the highest per-member travel costs at nearly $60,000, which was $16,000 above the national average. However, Ashton has noted that the airline Calm Air has a monopoly on flights in the north of Manitoba and that its prices are, quote, exorbitantly expensive, end quote. Quote, "When it's only one airline, you are completely beholden to their terms," end quote, she told Canada's National Observer. Quote, "The bottom line is we need competition and we need the federal government to step up and make that clear to airlines in regions like ours," end quote. Last month, Competition Bureau Canada announced it would undertake a study of competition in the nation's airline industry, noting, quote, "Since the Canadian population is spread out over vast distances, other modes of transportation may not be feasible replacements for air travel. More competition in the industry will mean lower prices, better services, and improved productivity," end quote.
So, as it relates to Nikki Ashton's riding. It's a massive riding. It goes from the top of the border of Manitoba and Nunavut all the way down to near the bottom of Lake Winnipeg. So it is a really, really vast area. And there's regional airport hubs all over Manitoba, because there's not a lot of people in Manitoba. There's like 2.5 people per square kilometer for the whole province, right? So there's not a lot of people in Manitoba. And that makes it less necessary to have roads everywhere. So, there's not necessarily going to be a road from one, point A to point B in a straight line. And that makes air travel more practical in that sense. Now, the one thing she did say is that Calm Air is exorbitantly expensive. So I don't know where Nikki lives, but one of the areas that she could fly out of is Thompson, Manitoba, down to Winnipeg in order to fly to Ottawa, because it looks like Calm Air doesn't fly to Ottawa or anywhere, really vast across the country. It looks to be more of a regional airline, but I could be mistaken on that. However, just based on that, a flight from Thompson, Manitoba to Winnipeg, Manitoba is about $1,000.
That's really expensive for just a few cities away.
It is.
Well, I guess they're not cities. I guess regions is probably more accurate.
Right. But the thing is the airfare allegedly of this trip was $13,000. So, okay, let's kind of put that together. So if you're buying for 4 people, so that's $4,000, call it $8,000 return. That's just from Winnipeg to Thompson. And then it's between $200 to $600 in economy class from Winnipeg to Ottawa. So that kind of lines up, and I'm hoping that she went economy class. But this is the problem. If you choose to bring your husband, and this is nothing to do with parliamentary business, should you really be, using your parliamentary credits to pay for them? And that's the other thing that we should talk about, is that MPs actually get a certain number of credits to pay for family coming with them and back in terms of their travel to Ottawa.
I don't think it's for family, is it? It's supposed to be for their flights to and from their constituencies.
But you can use it for your family as well.
Oh, okay, that is permitted.
So
all right.
you're just going to be using more of your credits, right? So so that's the thing to consider. Now, $131,000. Like, that's a lot.
And you're already in Quebec, which is fairly close to Ottawa.
So it's interesting.
Yeah.
But in this case, she's saying, well, I paid back $2,900. Okay. That's all well and good, but the major question here is, what parliamentary business were you doing? She's saying she met with stakeholders.
Who?
Who?
Why won't she name them?
And she was asked in this press conference, and she's like, well, I met with a number of people. Who? Like, give us one legitimate name, and then it's easy to cross-check that, and this story goes away for you. But you're not. Why?
Yeah, it is suspicious to me that she's not naming which stakeholders that she met with. This National Post article, and again, we'll link it in the comments so that you guys can read it too. It lists that during her trip to Quebec City, Nikki Ashton met with people working in the cultural sector of the Quebec Black community, people involved in a Fair Vote Quebec, an author, and people involved in the union movement. So again, even the article is not very specific as to who she met with.
Right, because that's all she will tell them. So, like, what's the problem? If this was the Conservatives and they refused to name who they were actually meeting with, the NDP would be having a field day.
Oh, of course they would. Even if it was the Liberals, they would be having a field day. But, you know, the thing that MP Ashton said that I believe is she said, I submitted my expenses to the House and the House approved them. I believe she's telling the truth. I believe that she submitted her expenses for this trip to the House and the House picked and chose what would be approved and what would not. And it sounds to me like maybe the House's rules are too lenient and they approve too much.
Well, especially when you're talking about taxpayer money, right? And this is where, this is where I think the more you make, the more responsible you should be expected to be. Meaning the more frugal you should be in regards to taxpayer money. Do I believe that MPs should be flying business class? No. Why? Because
slum it up in economy with the rest of us.
Well, and business class, all you really get is a bit more legroom. It's basically it. So, and you're paying almost twice the price for a seat. So I don't buy that.
Well, and if the House's rules are this lax, which, again, we don't have concrete proof, but kind of if we read between the lines, I think that's what's being said here. Should the NDP not be the ones championing to fix it?
Right, because they're allegedly the ones that are working for the working class Canadian. And if it's usually conservatives in the more rural ridings, why are the conservatives not racking up more travel expenses than the NDP?
Yeah, the NDP are the highest party, like when you break it down per person, the highest costing party. That's crazy. So
that's where this story comes from. So it's an interesting indictment on the NDP. Not to say that NDPs that or MPs that live in rural areas. Again, this is a massive riding, so I bet she has to spend, money in airfare traveling around the riding. I get it, but there needs to be some rules about being more frugal. To Tanya's point, so there's something else to write the NDP about. If you are really for championing a lower cost of living and spending taxpayer money wisely, then it starts with you, NDP. It doesn't start with anybody else. It starts with you. You should be at the bottom of these parties in terms of all of your expenses. So maybe lead by example.